in 1988. A man with haunted eyes and a suitcase full of old film tapes stepped off a plane and into an Alaskan summer that smelled of salmon and raw ocean wind. He had nothing left but a stubborn faith that he could live differently and that the wildest of animals might teach him how. This is the story of a man who chose to sleep within arm's reach of grizzly bears and called it salvation. The year is 1988. In a small New York apartment, scattered with past lives audition flyers, empty bottles, a childhood photos of a boy with a squirrel. A diary entry reads, "I came back from the edge after a near-fatal spiral and an overdose that shattered his whole life." The man who would become Timothy Treadwell began to look toward the wild not just for comfort, but for purpose. He later wrote that his brush with death pushed him to seek an entirely new life among the bears. Cut to a long shot of tundra and a single figure with a battered tent. The sea of bare grass ripples like an ocean. Timothy, in his own shaky voice, on tape, explains how the first encounter changed everything. The animal's immense size, its indifference, and that raw, honest presence that made human pretense feel petty. Where city life had been loud and uncertain, the bear's rhythms were blunt, direct, and honest. In that honesty, Timothy found his new identity. He named the bears, filmed them, and spoke to them as if they were neighbors. For more than a decade, every summer became the same ritual. Arrive at Hallow Bay, pitch camp, and settle into what he called the Grizzly Sanctuary. For 13 summers, he lived among coastal brown bears in Alaska's Katmai National Park. Timothy learned the tracks, the weather, the best fishing runs. He learned individual bears' habits and gave many of them names. He filmed relentlessly hours upon hours until his tiny collection became a private archive of intimate moments. Mothers teaching cubs to fish, disputes over salmon, the slow, dignified approach of an old male. He described his presence as a form of protection, an attempt to speak for animals he believed were misunderstood by humans. The footage is intoxicating. A cub clumsily wrestling with its sibling. Timothy laughing as a massive adult nudges at the camp's edge. A low, rumbling bear vocalization that seems almost conversational. This footage seduces you, pulling you into the intimacy, Timothy felt himself. And yet, every expert voice that appears in the story of the park biologist, the seasoned guide, the ranger introduces a stark counterpoint. The wild is not waiting to be loved. The bears are seasonal, opportunistic, and driven by instincts that ignore human morality. They are not actors in a human narrative. Over the years, park rangers and scientists documented their concerns. Timothy accumulated encounters and infractions noted by the National Park Service, repeated close approaches to wildlife, improper food storage, and other violations that made rangers uneasy. Those warnings would reappear like a slow drumbeat throughout the narrative. The story slows into the rhythm of his everyday life, waking at dawn with frost on the tent, boiling coffee over a single pot, following bear trails through thigh-high grass, and recording every odd behavior. Timothy's voiceover becomes confessional. He speaks of loneliness and of the comfort he took in these repetitive tasks. He tells anecdotes about particular bears he knew, a sow that tolerated him, an old male that drifted like a ghost through the brush. He sleeps lightly, waking to the thumps and snuffles of huge bodies nearby, and records it all like an obsessed historian. He would sometimes touch a cub. He would sometimes eat his food in the open while a bear was near, confident his presence wouldn't trigger an attack. These small human choices are the knots that bind the rest of the story. But halfway through, the tone changes. Intercut interviews show a scientist saying, gently but firmly, that habituating a wild animal can be deadly. When an animal regularly finds comfortable humans nearby, its natural wariness fades. A seasoned guide recounts watching Timothy from a boat and feeling a cold certainty that things could go terribly wrong. Local guides, park officials, and wildlife experts all expressed the same worry. Proximity to adult bears, especially during scarce salmon years or late in the season when food is precious, is a dangerous gamble. These tensions are reflected in Timothy's own journals, where he sometimes hints at exhaustion and frustration with park rules. There are moments of friction, shouted words at park rangers, a scuffle over camping regulations, and entries about being asked to leave. The public saw footage of majestic bears, but behind those frames were repeated cautions he chose to ignore. The film's final act compresses the slow creep of danger into a tightly wound week. It's late summer, early autumn of 2003, a time when bears fatten for winter and tensions run highest. Salmon runs are lower. Bears move unpredictably to find food. Timothy and a woman who traveled with him that year, Amy Wuganaji, camped closer than usual to a busy salmon stream. The landscape is a patchwork of mud, grass, and the constant, hungry rustle of wildlife. The weather is colder, the nights are longer, and the bear's hunger is more desperate. On October 5, 2003, Timothy and Amai were found dead, the tragic conclusion of a life spent too close to wildness. Their deaths were the result of a fatal bear attack. Subsequent reports indicated the bear was an older male, and its stomach contents contained human remains. The event reverberated through parks and conservation communities worldwide. The surviving evidence is gruesome and fragmentary. Hours of home video, a 6-minute audio tape that captured the initial chaos, and diaries that stopped mid. The camera that recorded their last days captured a few minutes of the attack's audio, but little to no usable footage of the event itself. The sounds on that tape shouted words, the terrifying animal noises. The scramble became part of the mystery. The audio was never publicly released in full. Those close to the case eventually destroyed parts of the recording, a painful decision that became another ethical knot in the story's retelling. When the cameras stopped, a storm of debate began. Admirers mourned a man who dedicated his life to the creatures he loved. Critics said his behavior had been reckless and selfish, placing both animals and park visitors at risk. Scientists used the tragedy to teach a grim lesson. The human desire to be close to wild animals can produce tragic outcomes when it overrides basic safety. Park regulations were reviewed, and educational programs about bear safety received renewed attention. The footage Timothy left behind became the subject of a documentary by Werner Herzog film that both honored the footage and questioned the man who made it. Herzog's film introduced Timothy to a global audience, presenting him as both charismatic and dangerously naive. But beyond policy and headlines, the story remains a human tragedy. Friends speak of Timothy's charm and his genuine devotion. In his private diaries, there are confessions of loneliness, glimpses of deep compassion, and the persistent refrain that the bears gave him a reason to live. The woman who destroyed some of the audio years later called the act a form of closure, a painful, careful choice to let certain horrors stay buried. People who knew Timothy still wrestle with him as a figure who embodied both salvation and folly. We end on a long panoramic shot of Hallow Bay at dusk. The story forces us to consider the line between passion and obsession. Are we allowed to court danger in the name of understanding? Does love excuse risk when other lives are involved? Timothy Treadwell's life forces an uncomfortable question. When we project human meaning onto the wild, who is really shaping whom? The bears remain indifferent and magnificent. Their lives continue on a schedule older than human grief. Timothy's footage gives us extraordinary access to their world access that came at the highest cost. The story closes, not with an answer, but with an invitation. to respect the wild on its own terms, to protect it without confusing intimacy for possession, and to remember that sometimes the most humane thing we can do is keep our distance. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the human experience.